Welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. On the 15th of August, 1879, a 26-year-old Vincent Van Gogh, looking thin and worn, suddenly appeared at his parents' home in the Dutch village of Etten. Vincent had crashed, burned, and lost his way in life again. His family bought him a new pair of boots, while his mother had new stockings ready, and his father gave the cherished new coat off his own back to his son. As an exhausted Vincent slipped away into his room to recover, his mother wrote an anxious letter to his brother Theo, describing how Vincent is reading books by Dickens all day long and does not speak apart from giving answers, sometimes correct, sometimes strange ones. If only he adopted the good things from these books. The mother's wish was to be granted, as Dickens was for Van Gogh more than mere escapism. These great novels and their philosophies were a kind of mental scaffold for him that not only helped him to believe in his own mission as an artist, but also pull himself out of deep depressions, citing remedies from Nicholas Nickleby such as a glass of wine, a piece of bread and cheese, and a pipe of tobacco, or that important message which recurs so many times in Vincent's letters from the haunted man, "Lord, keep my memory green." Here to talk to us today about the powerful connection between Dickens and Van Gogh is the inimitable Carol Jacobi, Curator of British Art, 1850 to 1915, at the Tate Britain, where her many exhibitions included the celebrated Van Gogh in Britain. But before we invite her in, something to consider is how easy it is for us to always see Vincent as a downtrodden, tragic figure who eventually took his own life. But to only see him as a victim is to completely misunderstand the man. As Vincent said himself, "Though I am often in the depths of misery, there is still a calmness, pure harmony, and music inside me." Carol, hello, and welcome to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. I'm thrilled to have you here.
I'm thrilled to be here, thanks.
Thank you. Well, to get to talk about one of the most loved and most brilliant artists of all time, but somebody that, interestingly, was not just a casual reader of Dickens. He absolutely loved Dickens in ways that I had no idea about.
Yes, Van Gogh was already reading Dickens as a child. His whole family were Dickens enthusiasts, and he was even reading him in English as well as in translation. He'd have been about 16 when Dickens died, but was already a big enthusiast by that time.
And what does he mean to you, in your role as a curator at the Tate? What do his works mean to you personally? When did you first come across him?
It's interesting because I think my enthusiasm for both of them originates in a similar place, and that's the way they found a poetry of the everyday, an ennoblement of cheap, accessible art. That's for me, very much at the heart of what I do as a curator as well. They find this wonderful poetry in everyday life.
Yes. Something that strikes me about both Van Gogh and Dickens is that they're greats in their worlds, but actually they're also loved by people that aren't very interested in the art world or don't really read books, but they love Dickens' characters. And that's something, I think, deeply powerful and profound, that they have that common touch as well. That's not meant in a patronizing way, but they can reach so many people beyond their own circle.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to know a bit more about Van Gogh's background and the change in his character and his beliefs that came about in London, partly through reading Dickens. So he came from a family of ministers and art dealers in the Netherlands, of course, and he was sent to London for his first job, which was working as an art dealer. He never had any idea of becoming an artist. And I think it was in London, which we have to remember, and of course Dickens is the great poet of London, was by far the biggest and most modern and most fast-changing city on the planet. I mean, what an amazing place to get sent to at the age of 20. He actually really fell out of love, well, with capitalism, with this search for success, particularly financial success, and a sort of class success, which his family were sort of quite keen on. That he started to express his opinions at his place of work. He worked at Goupil & Co. in Covent Garden and actually eventually got let go because he became a very modest person. He embraced a very, very modest lifestyle, which he kept through the rest of his life. And he wanted to be, it sounds strange to us, but he wanted to be a missionary. There was this idea then that cities required missionaries. They required people to minister to the poor, to the people who weren't doing so well out of market capitalism, basically. And he tried to train as a missionary. He just worked voluntarily. He never managed to get a job. And that didn't work out, and he went back to Holland, and then he had a kind of ministry in a mining community, and that didn't work either, and he actually became completely desperate. His family were thinking about putting him into an asylum, and it was at this point that he went back to Dickens again, and he found his set of values in Dickens, that art was to be a kind of consolation. This is such a big idea for Van Gogh. And that art was a kind of ministry in itself. And he sort of started thinking maybe he could just do some drawings. Maybe he could go back to London and work as an illustrator. And so he was 28 when he took up art. But that journey from seeking a respectable life to feeling art should be for the people, the Dickens books were there, particularly Hard Times, all the way through that really painful journey he had.
Yes, and it's interesting because actually in his letters, he quotes Dickens a lot, doesn't he? But he mixes it in with passages of the Bible very often.
I think one of the interesting things about the 19th century in terms of religion is the way that there were so many different variations of religion and a lot of new kind of framing of even just Christian belief. Van Gogh was living in just sort of north of Brixton in London. And when he became alienated from his landlady, mainly because he'd fallen in love with a daughter and that passion was not reciprocated, he was actually living just off the Kennington Road, right next to one of the biggest churches, evangelical churches in London, which was sort of, a lot of these churches were promoting Christian socialist values. This is the beginning of socialism, of course. And Christianity that was practical, that would do something to help people's lives, particularly the poor and the powerless. And of course, Van Gogh was very influenced by those narratives in London. And so in the Borinage, in the mining area of Belgium that he went to work as a minister, he actually gave up his lodgings. He gave it to a homeless person and went and lived in his hut and slept on the floor and gave away all his food. In a very Van Gogh way, he absolutely, applied these new ideas, these sort of emergent socialist ideas, very literally and very passionately, and with this incredible love for his fellow human beings, which he always had. And of course, he lost that post because the church felt that he was bringing the church into disrepute. They didn't think he was being dignified enough in his post. So for him, particularly going back to Hard Times, when it seemed that nobody really understood what he was trying to do, and he didn't seem to be having any success in what he was trying to do, he could find those values in Dickens, in reading Dickens' books. So he mentions Dickens in 54 of his letters. And it's interesting because those mentions are all collected around this absolutely desperate period when he is unemployed, when he's asking, what am I good for? And he actually says that in an amazing letter to his brother, what am I good for? And that's when he's mentioning Dickens all around that period.
What am I in the eyes of most people? A non-entity, an eccentric or an unpleasant person. Somebody who has no position in society and will never have. In short, the lowest of the low. All right then. Even if that were absolutely true, then I should one day like to show by my work what such an eccentric, such a nobody, has in his heart. That is my ambition, based less on resentment than on love in spite of everything, based more on a feeling of serenity than on passion.
And then the other time when you get a lot of mentions of Dickens are after he has his major breakdown in the south of France towards the end of his career. When he goes out, and as soon as he gets out of hospital after self-harming, after cutting his ear, the first thing he does is go out and buy a translation of Dickens' Christmas stories.
Yes, it's amazing, isn't it? So Dickens was a kind of inspiration and a solace to him.
Yeah, solace is a good word, and I think Van Gogh saw his art, he wanted his art to perform a similar function. I mean, obviously he did want to get some sort of financial independence through his art because he always felt very, very guilty that his brother, who stayed an art dealer and was quite successful as an art dealer, his brother basically maintained him with a very modest income. And he did want to pay his brother back and have some success. But the real value for him of his art. And so he says, my whole life is aimed at making the things from everyday life that Dickens describes and these artists draw. So he's not just interested in Dickens, he's interested in illustrations of Dickens and other sort of social realist prints, which he had a huge collection of. For him, Dickens was like a fantastic example of how you could turn realism into poetry. And he wanted to get some quality in his painting that was same with Dickens' language. And what he saw in it was this quality, not only of realism, but of real ability to stir emotions in the viewer or the reader. And he felt that the realist art of his own country, there was a real tradition of realism in his own country, but he didn't feel it had that extra quality, that quality to just stir you and move you and possibly console you.
It's interesting because you saying that, to begin with, it reminds me, talking about the Potato Eaters, that very early painting. I think that's an extraordinary one. It's not what you associate with Van Gogh, is it, initially? All the browns in there.
Mm-hmm. Could I introduce you to an almost completely unknown drawing by Van Gogh?
Of course, yes.
It's called Miners Walking in the Snow. And I think anyone who looks at it will be very surprised because it looks like it's been drawn by a child. And this is one of the first ever times he thought, right, I am going to try and do a drawing. And as you can see, he still has a lot to learn. The figures are very kind of, anatomically strange. And so he does this after he gets sacked from being a minister in the mining area, but he's gone back there to live with a miner and to work out what he's going to do with his life.
Yes.
And so this is his first attempt. So I think it's absolutely fascinating. So he is 27, and this image is inspired by hard times. In particular, Dickens' sort of imagery, Dickens describes it as a wild country undermined by deserted coal shafts and spotted at night by fires and black shapes of stationary engines at pits' mouths. And of course, Van Gogh's been living this, so Dickens is really speaking to him. And he's particularly interested in the character of Stephen Blackpool, this sort of struggling hero, and also being a working class hero because, of course, Dickens and George Eliot, Van Gogh also loved Eliot, really kind of invented the working class hero. And in particular, what interests me is that there's all these little thorn trees. Can you see in the drawing?
Let me come back. Yeah.
All these little thorn trees. And what they refer to is Dickens describes the thorn trees growing around the mining district. And for Dickens, the fact that they still manage to grow and even to flower is a kind of sense of the possibility of nature in this industrial landscape. And you get lots of references in Van Gogh's letters around this time to the thorns in his own life. And he actually writes to his brother during this very, very depressed time, I have hopes that these thorns will bear white flowers in their time.
Yes. The branches, they seem incredibly faded, don't they? Almost kind of ghostly.
Yes, he's trying to do distance, I think.
I see.
So they get more faded as they go backwards. And it's a very ambitious drawing in that you've got the mine in the background and everything. And he's sort of also really interested in that dark light that Dickens describes as well, that the mine is almost like silhouettes. All the way through Van Gogh, you get these images of people walking. He was I don't know if Dickens was interested in Pilgrim's Progress, but Van Gogh was. And he saw that idea of the walking figure as a metaphor for the sort of struggle of life. He comes back to that all the time and often even depicts himself as that walking figure. And it's interesting that there were women there wearing trousers, which was quite normal at the time. Of course, children as well.
And like you said, their bodies seem a little bit out of proportion with each other, or a little bit not quite in the same space, which is so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, yes. I mean, it's very much a first go. And the other thing...
Not bad for a first go.
He's 27, and within 3 years, he's turned himself into the most fantastic draftsman. And the way he did this, because he did try and go to art school, he did try and get artists to teach him, and he fell out with all of them, and he hardly got any training. But he collected a huge number of black and white prints, illustrations of Dickens, illustrations of all kinds of things, particularly loop files, and he used them to learn to draw.
It's inspiring stuff as well, isn't it, to be self-taught in that way. And then so brilliant. And the Potato Eaters, that very early painting, I remember seeing this one for the very first time.
And you think, wow, is that a Van Gogh?
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? How would you describe it? I'm going to have links, obviously, to all of these so the listener can see it, but where would you start?
So Van Gogh basically had this 2 years in The Hague when he ended up, plastered his room with prints and taught himself to draw. And then he went and lived in other areas. And so he was living in the Borinage and again, in this very working class area. And he starts painting in oil. He thinks maybe I could be more than an illustrator. I could be a painter. So this is his first really ambitious picture. And of course, this could be a scene from Dickens. It's a family around a table coming together, having a meal, but an incredibly modest meal, just made up of potatoes and tea, I think, as the title suggests. And so, again, both Dickens and Van Gogh moved on from images of the working class that were kind of aimed at middle-class audiences and therefore made them picturesque and even perhaps exotic, to images that were really empathetic and which gives them the leading role. And so you've got these unidealized but incredibly human and tender portrait of 5 figures sitting around the table.
Yes.
The woman is pouring tea, and you've got the steam and you've got the light. What Van Gogh's learnt from the English printmakers is the way light can again turn ordinary things into poetry.
Yes.
Van Gogh's light is always wonderful. You can see the light just gives them this sort of beauty and gives this almost a kind of Last Supper or sort of religious sort of sense to the scene. Yes. With the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling above them all.
And their features to me look almost slightly potato-like, oddly. They're such funny shapes, aren't they, to their features, but they're also very, very quite attractive looking, aren't they? The couple on the left side and their eyes and everything.
Yeah, I think there's a humanity. Do you know that painting by Van Gogh of his boots?
Yes.
Which was around a similar time. Well, actually, he bought a pair of boots and scuffed them around Paris so they would have a story to them. So they'd look like, experiences had in these old boots. And he found a sort of beauty in what had previously been considered ugliness. He found this amazing beauty in those things, in people who were worn out. And he even talked about wanting the paint itself, the painting, to have the kind of texture of a potato.
Yes, yes, it's amazing. It's amazing. But there's something that, Carol, you will have seen this because you will have studied this properly, but I had never seen until I was preparing for this conversation, the picture on the wall on the left side. I think you can see 2 figures. One's in very bright red and very bright blue. Yeah. And there's this kind of star almost above their heads that kind of lines up with the flame of the lamp, which is so interesting because at first sight you think this is quite a muddy, coloured painting, but there you have something of the future Van Gogh tucked into that little corner there, of the colour that's about to explode later on.
I wonder if that is a cross, and there's the figures at the base of a cross, which is a very standard religious subject of sacrifice, of course, but also of hope and renewal. And I think that might be a religious print of that subject. And of course, this ties into the idea of the importance of art for everybody's lives. That even these people who are very, very poor have got this work of art, this humble work of art on their walls. I think you might be right that there is definitely a chiming going on between the real light in the lamp and the shape of the cross, which is interesting that it's picked out in white in the print. I think that's a really interesting idea.
So often, you look at it and you don't really see so many of the details. And then I look at the man on the far left, our left, his shoulder, his right shoulder, has some of the traces of that blue, very bright blue on his shoulder that connects really to the blue in the portrait above his head.
Yeah, so that your eye doesn't miss it. If your eye's in the foreground, it gets led into the background to notice that print. That's amazing.
Yes, there you go. There's a very, very powerful connection between Van Gogh and his friend Gauguin, but also Dickens, isn't there? In the chairs, the empty chairs. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so obviously when Dickens died, it was a worldwide event. And famously, Luke Fildes, who became one of Van Gogh's hero artists, made this very famous image of Dickens' study and the chair empty. And Van Gogh came back to this image when he set out what he thought of as his Studio of the South. Van Gogh, he sort of imagined this surrogate brotherhood of his heroes, in particular people like Dickens, the printmakers like Luke Fildes, and even the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. He was thinking when he went down to Arles and he bought the Yellow House, the famous Yellow House, or he rented, the famous Yellow House, and he invited other artists to come down. He was imagining a sort of new kind of brotherhood. And so hardly anyone came. Only Gauguin turned up, unfortunately. And in anticipation of Gauguin coming, he made these two paintings of his own chair, Van Gogh's chair and Gauguin's chair. And I just think they're just so wonderful. It's something that Van Gogh and Dickens had in common, the way that very ordinary objects could become incredibly resonant and full of sort of human presence and even human stories. So he's taken that idea of the empty chair from the Fildes print, which was very, very famous, and he's done his own chair and Gauguin's chair. And his chair is, of course, a very plain, modest, kind of peasant-style chair with brush seating, and on it he puts his tobacco. So the idea of a chair, somewhere you rest, somewhere you have a smoke, again, this lovely sort of idea of consolation. And in the background, there are these, a little box of onions, of all things, and they're sprouting. So they're a little bit like the flowering thorns. There's this sort of sense of hope. Whereas Gauguin's chair is very different, because Van Gogh understood Gauguin's very different character. It's nighttime rather than the daytime. It's a rather curvy, sort of slightly sort of show-offy kind of chair. And it's got these sort of slightly weird purple shadows, reflections coming off it, and a candle and books. So it's very much more about the life of the mind and the imagination. And you've got the sort of gaslighting in the background. And of course, Gauguin thought Van Gogh was really misguided to always base his art on something real, to sort of sit down in front of something real and paint. Whereas he felt that the best art came from your mind, from your imagination. And he even got Van Gogh to try this a couple of times while they were staying together in Arles. And again, I think that's why Dickens is important, because he sort of regrounded Van Gogh in an art of the real. And of course, in a way, these chairs which were painted in such hope of brotherhood, hold the seeds of what went wrong, and Gauguin and Van Gogh never really got on. They got on less and less, and it was Gauguin's imminent departure that precipitated, or slightly caused, Van Gogh's breakdown, his self-harm, his first really serious period of illness.
You placing both those chairs next to each other, it's so interesting to see also that Gauguin's chair is very kind of dynamic, isn't it? An extrovert, whereas Van Gogh's character the seat in that chair is much more quiet and calm and sort of withdrawn. And it seems like Gauguin's chair is angled in the same way as Dickens's empty chair in that Luke Fildes
It's really
print.
similar, isn't it?
Yeah. The arms as well, these very sturdy arms.
Yes. And actually, don't you think that the sort of the speckled ground that the chair is sitting on is really like the carpet in the Fildes print?
Oh, yes. Yes, it is.
Whereas you've got this sort of nice, sort of modest terracotta stone floor in Van Gogh's chair.
And something else you just mentioned, you described the weird purple shadows on the legs of the Gauguin chair. Mm-hmm. And of course, you're completely right. And I didn't see that. He puts it together so well as a painter, Van Gogh, that you don't immediately think, oh, that's an odd colour of shade for the legs of that chair. It just seems to fit together so well.
And I think to a lot of people in this period, these pictures would have seemed like either incredibly crudely painted or as perhaps sketches for a painting, that's going to be more finished, more detailed. And what Van Gogh saw was the incredible power that there was in making something really simple and making the brushstrokes really obvious and engaging, and the sort of simplicity, and realised that you get something much more powerful from this style.
I seem to remember that in a big argument between Gauguin and Van Gogh, that Gauguin had said to Van Gogh, "You overload your brush." What an insult. It's kind of like saying Dickens uses too many words. And you think...
Which you could say that, actually.
Well, you can say that. If you're not going to be a fan, if you're not on board, then yes to both of those. But of course, it's a ridiculous... and you don't get the sunflowers, do you, in quite the same potency if the brush isn't really thick with paint.
I think it's quite a paradox that Van Gogh is painfully aware all the time of how much he's costing his brother. And his brother is the person, of course, is sending him paint down from Paris. And yet he's using it. He's using this paint at this huge rate. There's so much going on to these canvases. Yeah.
There's that fantastic painting, The Prisoner's Round. That's really something again, isn't it, I think?
The one thing almost everyone knows about Van Gogh was that he was mentally ill. And I think there is a tendency to look at the paintings and the incredible passion of the brushstrokes and the directness of them as connected to the mental distress. And the thing that breaks my heart is that after he had that first breakdown for which he was hospitalised, and he only survived because there happened to be a doctor who was a specialist in the kind of wounds he had, is that he felt that he was going to have a new start. He went out and bought Dickens, and he also bought Harriet Beecher Stowe's anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was another favourite of his, along with A Christmas Carol. And of course, not that long after, he had another period of mental illness, and these were very serious. And there was a petition in the town of Arles to get him put into prison or incarcerated, because people were frightened mental illness at that time. Mm. And so he actually booked himself into a hospital for the mentally ill. And that's when this painting was painted. And of course, what happened there was that he didn't get better. There wasn't really any treatment of those days. He just carried on having these periods of being reasonably well, and then these periods, as he called them, crises, of breakdowns. And eventually he came to understand that they were going to carry on forever. And it's really heartbreaking reading his letters when you see him realizing that this is going to keep happening. You see him realizing that this is going to mean that he's always going to be reliant on his brother, who's just got married and is due to have a baby. So he's particularly worried about this. And there are often times when he can't get outside to paint. And so he asks his brother to send him prints. And he starts to paint from prints. So this is a print that he loved when he was in London of Newgate Prison. And it's from Doré's book of images of London, amazing book of really modern, up-to-date images of London, which draws on Dickens' sketch of Newgate, which is a heartbreaking piece of writing, incredible piece of writing. And so he goes back to that imagery of Newgate. Of course, he would have walked past Newgate many times when he was living in London, back to that imagery of Newgate, and does this image of imprisonment. And during this period, it describes his time at the asylum, especially when he can't go outside, as a period of imprisonment, often. And you can see that if you're looking at the picture, you can see that you've got these people walking like those very first miners, but they're walking in a circle now. It's a completely pointless, repetitive existence of walking. And you can see that the person in the foreground has actually got their head raised and the light is just catching the top of their head. And it's really hard to resist the idea that this figure is a little bit like Van Gogh.
I assume it was, Carol. Is it possibly not? I totally thought that was him painting himself into it.
Yeah, I mean, he often does paint himself, obviously, and it's not exactly a portrait, but as we know, he has this deep identification with what he was painting, whether it was a mother rocking her child in a cradle or a pair of boots, and so I think we can say he was deeply identifying with these prisoners, and that figure does really draw our eye. Also, a couple of changes that he made to the Doré print. One is that the image gets more sunny as you go up. There is a sense that there is light beyond this claustrophobic space. And just in case you think I'm making it up, he added 2 little butterflies right at the top.
Oh, I've never seen those. I'm zooming in. Yes, I can see them. Gosh.
And it's interesting that immediately after painting this picture, he left. He decided that there was, no future staying in this hospital in Saint-Rémy. And he made his last move. He was always moving about, always looking for a life where he could paint. And he moved back up near Paris, so he wouldn't be so far from his brother Theo, who was an art dealer in Paris. And during that period, he painted at least a picture a day. He was so prolific. And then he shot himself. And no one knows exactly why. I feel he knew by this time that another breakdown would be coming. Maybe he could feel when it was going to happen. I don't know. Certainly, he met his little nephew, who was also called Vincent, and he was sort of concerned, I think, for his brother. No one really knows why, but certainly his sense of imprisonment, which he felt so strongly, not just imprisoned but in the asylum, and not just imprisoned by his illness, but imprisoned by social prejudices, expectations of respectability, traditional understandings of art, I think is distilled in this painting.
It's so interesting because the colour, if you just absorb the colour and don't even think of what it represents or see the detail of the figures, it's actually quite a bright, positive colour in lots of ways, isn't it? I mean, essentially they look like they're down the bottom of a well, that they're walking the bottom.
Yeah.
But it's not kind of dark, earthy, damp, unwholesome looking until you really take in the expressions on the faces and their bodies. I think that's interesting.
It gets more and more buttery as it goes up, doesn't it?
Yes. And oddly, the colour, the entire colour palette of this image reminds me so much of the colour in one of his self-portraits, of his own skin, his own hair, his blue clothes.
And that is the last self-portrait, so it's the closest self-portrait in date to this painting, and that blue is really interesting. It's that last self-portrait where he's just surrounded by these swirling blue lines.
Yes. And I always think that's quite a confident portrait of him, oddly.
I'm so glad you say that, because, as I say, Van Gogh's work is so often seen through this tragic lens.
Yeah.
And he's so often characterised as a victim, which, of course, he did have a very, very difficult life and a lot of unfortunate things. But I think that portrait in particular, it's so, look at what I can do. Obviously, all these paintings, the next thing he does is send them up to Paris and sends them up to Theo. And, it's almost like he's at the very least, reassuring Theo, I'm whole, I'm a fantastic painter, I'm doing this amazing work in that portrait. I'm so glad you see that. One of the things that for me, I've never got over really, is a painting of a woman he knew in Arles, that he got involved with a particular family, and he paints the woman in the family as la berceuse, which means the woman rocking the cradle. And all you see in the painting is a woman. You don't see the cradle. You just see a little piece of rope coming from her hand that she's obviously tugging on to rock the cradle. So you imagine the cradle and the baby. And his idea of this painting was that if a sailor was away at sea and missing his home and missing his family, this would be a painting that, if it was hanging in his cabin, would console the sailor. And of course, and as he looked at the painting, his wooden cabin would be rocking backwards and forwards. So, he is like the baby in the cradle looking at this painting in his cabin. For me, this is sort of really just gives you a sense of the way Van Gogh saw his art, the way his mind was working.
Yeah, it's great, but it's so charged with colour, isn't it? It's amazing. It's only 3 years after The Potato Eaters, I think, this one.
Yes. I mean, this is the thing with Van Gogh. I mean, he just developed so fast. So although, when he started off, he was much older than a lot of artists are when they start off being artists, and he had so much catching up to do. But his art evolved at a tremendous speed. Just mentioning the Valenciennes, because this is the picture he painted after he had his first breakdown. And I mentioned, I think, that the first thing he did when he came out of hospital, he was still, I think, feeling pretty ropey. And he went out and bought French translation of Dickens' Christmas stories, including Christmas Carol and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. So, and you can see that in Valenciennes, he's included in the foreground the 2 books that he bought. Can you see that?
Yeah.
So he made many versions of this. She's got such a kindly look, and the books are there as objects of consolation, objects of sort of human connection he bought when he got out of the hospital.
Yes.
And I've actually tracked down the actual edition that you can see in the painting. It was obviously not a first edition, it was a later edition of the Christmas books.
Actual Dickens Christmas books in the picture is amazing, isn't it?
So we started the exhibition with this painting, and it was the room was completely empty. There was this painting, and then opposite it there was a bookshelf. And on the bookshelf we assembled all the books by writers in English that we know Van Gogh read as a young man and a boy. And we had sort of the editions from that Van Gogh himself would have looked at. And it was really interesting to sort of see how incredibly well read he was and how incredibly immersed he was. I don't think people realised that he spoke English, French, German, as well as Dutch. And, sometimes he'd spend his time translating, just to occupy his time. So,
and in your exhibition, did you have the Starry Night over the Rhone?
Yes, there's 2 Starry Nights. There's one in New York and one in Paris. And we had the one in Paris. He started off drawing that sort of image in London, drawing the new embankment with the new electric lighting. It's only just gone in. And that polluted city with the lights glimmering in the River Thames. And he comes back to that idea with the Rhone when he goes down to the south of France in Arles. And again, it was Doré who'd first turned this very modern industrial image into a work of art. And Van Gogh sort of, obviously, like many artists, he had an amazing visual memory, and he sort of blends that in with his experience of art.
This Starry Night feels much calmer and less turbulent than the other one, which is obviously you're much closer to the stars swirling.
Absolutely. And that is because it was painted when he'd first arrived in Arles, when he was planning the studio south. He was very optimistic. You can see he's just doing these amazing new things in painting. Whereas the other Starry Night, the one in New York, was done in the hospital. And it was later. It's far more visionary. It was possibly the view from his window. And it's also, he's moved on with his style. He's really exploring what you can do with curved brushstrokes that sort of almost whisk your motions up in the second Starry Night.
Carol, it's been wonderful to talk to you about all of this. Thank you so much for your time. I've really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it too.
Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. If you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation towards the costs of producing them, please follow the link at the bottom of the description and you can make a donation there. Every coffee you buy makes a huge difference. Thank you ever so much and see you next time.